Hi, I'm Ella Spencer. Today we're going to have lunch. Only we're going to talk about lunch more than we actually consume it. I have two women here who are experts on food, and we're going to talk about food and sustainability and all kinds of good things. Laurie Stahlbrand is a professor at George Brown College here in Toronto. And she's an expert on sustainable food, everything from the field to the fork. And I never knew her before. We've only just met, really, although we have a lot of friends in common. And I remember vividly, way back when, she was a CBC broadcaster. And I remember hearing her voice on the radio, but I think it was before the days of television.
Not quite that far back, but
I don't remember seeing you on TV, but I remember your name very well. So hi, Laurie. It's great to be here. And her friend, and they know each other quite well because they work together a lot, I think, is Debbie Field. And Debbie Field is, again, somebody that I should know because I've known her husband for 100 years. But I don't know how much we have met in other contexts. Hi, Debbie. How are you?
I'm good.
Debbie is a coordinator of something, the Coalition for Healthy School Food. And she is obviously somebody who knows her way around the kitchen and the distribution of food, especially to children, I imagine. Now, I don't know what we're going to talk about because we never plan what to say, but we just get acquainted in a friendly way. And I certainly have things on my mind to explore with you. But I'll tell you, I have a lot of interest in in agriculture and regenerative farming and so on, and how to farm sustainably. But I haven't really explored very much the things that come after the farming, the processing of food, the transportation, the delivery of food, and so on. So how can we make that more sustainable? And I think that may be a common area. I'm sure that Debbie's concern is also about making sure that people consume the right kinds of nutritious food, children at least. Is that right?
For sure. And making sure that children get a taste for healthy food each day at school and also access it each day at school. I mean, Canada is literally the only G7 country without a harmonized federal school food program, one of the only ECD countries. There's a growing movement all over the world, which is talking about one healthy meal for every child in the world by the year 2030, connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. So yeah, it's an unusual thing. You know, Canadians pride ourselves on advanced social policy on many levels, but not when it comes to school food.
Okay, well, now we were just a minute ago talking about Anthony Bourdain, and I remember one show that he did in France, which really made the rest of the world look pretty pathetic, because he showed us I think an elementary school lunch cafeteria when the kids were it wasn't cafeteria, they were served, I believe. They were sitting and being served the most elegant meal you ever saw. It was just cuisine of the highest order. I don't remember what was on the menu, but I remember he was describing all of the, gastronomic superlatives that he could invoke to describe this wonderful meal, and saying that the French children were taught to appreciate the quality of food as well as the nutritional value of it. And then you contrast that to some other thing that I remember from watching TV, where I think it was back in the days when John Chancellor was the NBC host or something with the news. And he reported on something where they were trying to explain how the nutritional quality of food for school kids was adequate. And the government, of course, was trying to cheat and save money and produce, just give them French fries stuff that didn't amount to much. They didn't offer a vegetable. So apparently the government suddenly claimed that they were serving them ketchup, and that was their vegetable for the day. And John Chancellor, I remember, was laughing, and he was covering his mouth because he knew he wasn't supposed to laugh at this, but it was such an absurd claim. So the disparity between the quality of food that's served to children in schools in various countries must be quite remarkable. What do you think about how Canada is handling teaching kids to appreciate good food?
Well, that's what we're working on. But let me just bring Lori in first for a second. So Lori is part of an amazing program at George Brown that is really trying to teach people about all of this in a new way. So Lori, why don't you describe that?
Well, it connects very much. Thank you, Debbie, with what we're talking about, because the reason why I was attracted to this program, to actually come in and develop this program, is because it is a chef school I'm working in. And we actually have young people who are interested in learning culinary skills and working in the field. So they're going to have that practical knowledge. And then what they need is more of the backstory of food, of an understanding of issues around health, equity, sustainability, and the policies that can support them. So it really works hand in hand with what Debbie's doing. As we start moving towards, hopefully, a national school food program in Canada, we need people who are going to be cooking for those programs, who have training in what is healthy, sustainable, ethical food, and are committed as all of us who are working on this are, to making sure that our kids are getting food that comes from sustainable sources and that is the result of equitable relationships, and that is healthy and is going to sustain their bodies and their minds so they can learn well and they can grow up strong and healthy. So it's really important to me that we're providing that educational underpinning now. And then the big piece of this, and this was actually a big area of my research and a nonprofit that I ran for many years called Local Food Plus, is that what we're talking about here is public food procurement. And public food procurement is really a sleeping giant that has incredible potential to address a range of problems in our society, including climate change, including inequity, including health and hunger. And it's really the direction we need to be going for a school food program. Because as Debbie, I'm sure, can go into a lot more detail, right now our school food programs have been done by people who care about this. So nonprofits, the City of Toronto, all sorts of different organizations contribute, but we don't have a national program and one that actually understands the power and the potential of public food procurement. So maybe
tell me why that is such a great thing. I mean, why not, how is that better than having people go shopping at their local supermarket?
Well, this is what you can do with public food procurement. You can buy from small scale farmers, from family farmers. You can support local food. You can support sustainable food. Otherwise, generally, the kind of food that we're served in institutions is food that is being served by one of the three big global corporations, Sodexo, Aramark, or Compass Foods. And it is food that they are sourcing from everywhere in the world with no real standards around equity, with a great deal of exploitation, and they're actually undermining the food system, a healthy food system. So with the concept of public procurement, we can actually set guidelines that can start to say, we want to support family farmers. We want to support sustainable agriculture. We want to support BIPOC farmers and infrastructure of the middle, small scale infrastructure, for example. And that will all start to bring us the kind of food we want. We want to support small distributors and small food service companies, or cook the food in the schools themselves as self-operated. There's so many policy things that can happen through public food procurement that can really help to address many of the problems we're facing in the world right now.
Okay, how does that, so I mean, I'm not probably sufficiently mindful of the harm being done, if you want to call it that, by big food chains that, I can imagine they certainly buy things by the tons and tons and distribute it in some logical way, but not small. You're talking small both in terms of producers and all the way to.
I'll tell you a good story that comes from Ontario, and there are similar ones all across the country. So there's a really great organization called Norfolk Fruit Growers Association. They were actually one of Lori's first members in Local Food Plus, and they are integrated pest management. So they're not totally organic, but they're moving towards sustainability. They use as least pesticides as they can. And they are 20 family farmers who all are a co-op together, and together they bag their apples and their pears in one bag. It all gets commingled at this warehouse in Norfolk. And they grow, there's a little apple that doesn't make it to market in Canada because it's too small. Grocery stores tend to sell us these massive, big apples, often imported from New Zealand or the United States or BC, but not Ontario, or they're sold for juice, or they're sold to England, where there is a market for small apples. And when I was working at an organization called Food Share Toronto, we figured out a way to work with these apple growers. And a great, brilliant woman named Mary Lou Morgan figured out a way to get the Norfolk fruit growers to bag 100 apples in a big plastic bag, and a kid could carry it to his classroom or her classroom. And we could, I think even today they can sell that for like $5.90 or $6. So a kid can each get that little apple that was grown right here in Ontario. So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about.
And this stuff is connected to global forces. So, for example, Norfolk they were selling into England because they were under so much pressure and couldn't sell their apples locally because the market of Washington apples was just saturating us here, or apples from somewhere else in the world, South Africa, and places like that, China. So everybody was being pushed to sell apples into a different market, and everyone was being undercut along the way. Pressure to grow with more pesticides, and never any thinking about the cost of all this transportation to the environment, the climate change implications. We have fantastic apples here in Ontario, but the global food system was creating this kind of distortion, so our own farmers couldn't sell into our own market. And what Debbie was doing was fantastic, because those little small apples are perfect for kids' hands, and the farmers were getting next to nothing for them because they didn't fit the size that the grocery stores wanted. So it was a win-win all around. And there's so many stories like this in the food system. And when you said, are they doing harm, the big corporations, indeed they are. Harm is the right word. They are destroying the planet. Up to a third to 40% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the food system. And a lot of it has to be laid at the feet of the major corporations, such as the food service corporations, the large farmers of intensive livestock operations, the Tyson Foods of the world, or the Cisco's. They are just looking to ravage the earth for the cheapest food possible and the biggest profit for their corporations. And we are all paying a price for that. So we need a new kind of food system. And that's what we're trying to build. And that's what Debbie is working on in terms of one of the pieces of that is how do we ensure, the other big problem, of course, with our current food system is there's plenty of food, but there's still so many people going hungry right in our own cities. And that makes no sense. So, what Debbie's working on is so important in terms of making sure that every child gets a healthy meal every day. Right now, that's not the case.
So what happens in Toronto schools? So, surely the kids do get lunch. Are the kids? No.
No,
do they bring their own lunch, or what do they do?
There's everything is different everywhere. The good news in Toronto is through the City of Toronto contributing quite a lot of money over decades and working with provincial money as well. We have a pretty good mid-morning snack that is served to about 60% of the kids in the city, but not all of them. And across the country, there's only about 30% of the schools that have some kind of a program, either breakfast, lunch, or snack. So
what would they be serving them for snacks?
The snack is really great because it could be a piece of cheese and a bagel and a piece of fruit, or an apple, or a carrot. So it's always going to be one vegetable or fruit and one protein and one carbohydrate. So yeah, the mid-morning snack is great, and people love it. People of all incomes love it.
So now what you want is a nationwide program funded by the federal government, or
cost shared between the federal government and the provinces. Mm-hmm. And this is something we've been working on for decades. And just recently, we have a bit of optimism because for the first time in Canadian history, 2 mandate letters, Minister of Agriculture federally and Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development, have it in their mandates to work together to launch a national food policy and to begin a meals program. So the Liberals put $1 billion over 5 years in their pre-election budget, and the NDP $1 billion over 4 years. It's not enough, but it's enough to at least get started. So that's what my coalition's working on right now, is trying to make sure the federal government begins this process. But there's a lot of jurisdictional issues because provinces see education as their issue. So there's some heavy negotiating coming, kind of like the child care.
So it would be under the education rubric, not under, I don't know what you'd call it, food. There must be another.
But that's part of our problem. We need a minister. I think we need a minister for food at the federal level. We don't. We have a minister of agriculture and agri-food, which is about trade. But there are many examples. Brazil was the most prominent, but also a couple of the Scandinavian countries who have had somebody at the cabinet table who's responsible for food security or food. And we need that too.
Right now, we have ministers of natural resources, ministers of health, ministers of agriculture, ministers of environment, all these different things. And food is an important part of all of them, but they each take a very different perspective. And as a result, food slips through the cracks, and we're not thinking enough about our food system. It's really always focused on trade and international trade, which is, obviously there's going to be some international trade, but what ends up happening is we end up with what's known as redundant trade, where we end up importing the same things we're exporting with just tons of greenhouse gas emissions, because there is nobody thinking about this in a systemic way. So this happens with a lot of products that we're importing the same things we're exporting.
Well, tell me about food banks, because I'm just thinking, when we look at the need to provide nourishment for poor people, I think most people don't think in terms of guaranteed annual income, or even in terms of food stamps. They don't have that in Canada, as far as I know, but they do in the US. But they think in terms of food banks, and I'm not sure how those work. Never been inside one, but I assume that people give their surplus canned goods or something, and then poor people, without being, what happens if somebody's poor? Do they have to prove that they're poor in order to come and get food, or what?
Yeah, for sure. It's a very stigmatized, difficult system. The majority of food is not the cans that you or I or Lori buy. It's industry rejects still. 70 or 80% of it is still waste from industry. And it's very bad, as you say, Meta. What we need to be looking at is adequate incomes. Nobody wants to go to the food bank. On my way here today, I was downtown and just rode home along College Street, and I saw a large line of people, and I wondered what it was. And it was people lined up with their shopping carts and their kids in front of a food bank, a really good food bank that tries to give out healthy food, but can't always. And it's just a terrible system, and things have gotten, of course, much worse in the last few months, first through COVID and now through this terrible increase in food prices that we're seeing. So,
but also, the whole concept of the food bank was meant to be a stopgap measure. When we started to see the end of industrial jobs, we had our first food banks in the 80s, early 80s in Toronto. And at that time, everyone was appalled that a wealthy city like Toronto would have a food bank. And we thought, okay, this is a stopgap measure, as there's some adjustments happening in the economy. But in fact, this started to happen throughout the whole part of Canada and the US that could be known as the Rust Belt, where we lost so many industrial jobs. And after a few years, they realized this is not going away. This is not a stopgap. This is getting worse. And then in Toronto, one of the first organizations that was actually created to provide some different kinds of solutions was Food Share, the organization that Debbie ran for many, many years, to take a look at how can we use other means than giving out stale dated food and cans that nobody wants, just to hold body and soul together. And then the next big thing, we started to realize we needed policy around this. And that was at the arrival of the Toronto Food Policy Council, where I also worked. And Debbie was also very involved in that, and many people in our circle, thinking, how do we come up with policy tools to address this? And unfortunately, because this is such a huge global problem, and there are many forces that are beyond our control, we haven't been able to end food banks. I mean, the fact that we have such inflation now is related to all sorts of international reasons, as well as things that are happening in Canada or in Ontario. So we're stuck with food banks right now, but we're looking for other solutions. So food banks are not a solution. They're holding body and soul together for people who otherwise would be going hungry.
Well, are there people, is there enough in the food banks for the people who actually need it?
No.
No, there still isn't even enough to go around that way. Is that right?
No. And people can only go every month. There's a lot of myths about food banks. I mean, before I was involved at Food Share, I had no idea what the system looked like. I assumed that people could get adequate food and go when they need it, but it's not what it is. And you have to show a lot of papers, and, you have to
That is shocking to me. My assumption was, that people would not go unless they had to. The people are not going to want to. It's kind of embarrassing. Yeah. And so I assumed that anybody who showed up would just say, well, come right in and take care of whatever you want, because, we wouldn't want to ask anybody to actually prove that they needed it. That'd be sort of shameful to ask.
But the need is so great. They run out of food. I mean, with my family and my late husband, Wayne Roberts, a couple of times we lived on, as part of a sort of publicity thing, we lived on a food bank diet for a week with our family. In one case, we were given a certain amount of money and we had to buy the things we needed. In another case, we were given a basket of what we needed to live on for a week. And we did this with my younger daughter, who was still at home at that time. And I'll tell you, we learned a lot. It was tough. It was, we all became hangry. We didn't have, we had things happening in our lives. Like, for example, I sing with a choir, and every week someone would bring a snack. Well, on that kind of a budget, there's no way I could afford to bring a snack for everyone, and so then you're embarrassed about that. Or a friend of mine, her father passed away, and we obviously broke the diet when this happened. You bring food to people, you get invited over and you're supposed to bring a bottle of wine or something to contribute to the meal, and you don't have any money to buy these things, and you're living on next to nothing. And the food we were given to eat was very poor quality. By and large, there were not much fresh fruits and vegetables. It's a lot of canned stuff. Mm-hmm. It's things like wieners and beans, and, you get some canned tuna, whatever. Maybe we got some potatoes and onions, but it was not at all what people need for a healthy diet. There was no choice involved. Some food banks, there's limited choice, and it was just not enough. So food banks are most definitely not the answer. I'm grateful they're there right now for the people who need them, but the crucial thing is to move away from food banks.
Well, would you support guaranteed annual income?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Both of us would.
Yeah, well, I've had several talk shows about that, and I'm very enthusiastic about that. But anyway, but there are many other things. Now, go back and tell me a little bit more about why big chains, grocery chains, are doing harm. I need to be enlightened on why they are bad.
So first of all, it's not just grocery chains. Grocery chains are what we visually see, those of us, living an ordinary life buying food. But there are many players who we don't see. So a lot of them are big manufacturers, big processors, who then control what happens through the food chain. In both directions, or it's big food service corporations. Every mining camp and forestry camp and corporate cafeteria and schools, prisons, you name it, there's food needed. And there are global corporations. Some of the biggest corporations in the world are providing that food. So they have a big control over what's happening, but yet we never see them or encounter them or deal with them ourselves. Big food companies that are producing animals in very inhumane conditions and that are very counter to ecological principles. We don't even know them because they then sell to manufacturers and you see a brand and you don't even understand how the brands are all connected. You know, often there are just a few mega companies that have many different brands out there that make it look like it's Farmer Joe's sausages, but in fact, it's still a product of this whole system. So it's not by any means just the retailers, but everybody is playing a role, and all of these big folks, first of all, they're driven by the profit motive. They're not driven by sustainability. They're not driven by health. They're not driven by equity. And they're getting the food as cheaply as they can from wherever they can in the world. And this is destroying livelihoods in other parts of the world and also making it very difficult for our farmers because they're being undercut. So to buy food from Canadian farmers, there is a cost of production. And if you can get it cheaper by exploiting a farmer in another part of the world and bring that in, and many farmers, often peasant farmers, indigenous farmers, are being exploited, and the food is being, we're buying that food at incredibly low prices, and our farmers can't possibly compete with that. And so then they start to have problems with being able to sell, or they're looking
No,
for.
I thought it was the other way around. I assumed that the problem was mostly suffered by small farmers in faraway places who couldn't compete with Western industrialized farming, and therefore they were the ones who couldn't make a good living. But you're saying that our farmers can be beaten out by the small farmers in Peru or
That's right. There is not, without solidarity. I mean, it's not one or the other. The system, they're working every angle of the system. So small farmers are struggling, and it's very complex, all the different relationships. Peasant farmers around the world are being driven off the land and are going under because they, at a certain point, they can't continue to produce at that low a price. So I'm very much in favor of that we need to be supporting local and sustainable food systems, territorial food systems, as a way to have a better understanding of equity issues, and then be in solidarity with farmers in other parts of the world to be doing the same thing in their communities. So the answer to, hunger is not what Bono was promoting, that more food, we buy more from farmers in the global south. It's that farmers in the global south need to be growing for their own people and for their own communities, and we need to be doing the same here. And so we need to have more control over our food system locally, and therefore we can address more issues around climate change and around equity and ultimately around health.
Okay, well, my heart would be immediately taken by, I'd be on your side immediately, except that I realize, okay, in Canada, what can we raise here? Well, maybe turnips. I spent a lot of my time, my younger years in California. So it would be fine in California, but I don't see that we're going to raise oranges here.
Actually, we're not going to raise oranges, but we are not just growing turnips by any means. I don't know if Debbie wants to step in here and talk about this, but we have some of the best Class 1 farmland in the world right here in Southern Ontario. We grow a huge range of vegetables. I live in the wintertime. My husband and I always, for the last decade, tried to live exclusively on local foods all winter long. And we did it. And we did it with style. And we didn't eat oranges in the middle of the winter. We didn't eat them very often at all. But we had many delicious foods that we were able to eat that came from here. So anyway, it's not all or nothing. I mean, it doesn't mean we're never going to import anything. We're never going to eat another orange. It's that we need to shift the balance towards territorial food systems.
Okay. Okay, I'm just going through my menu. How many things I buy that I really don't pay any attention to the origin of the stuff that I buy.
Well, you should be.
I'm sorry.
This is an interesting time of year, right? So we start to get, let's say, asparagus and peas and spinach. And Mary Lou, again, who I mentioned before, taught me a very interesting lesson, which is hold off and don't buy corn and asparagus a month earlier. Just wait a month and you can have your wonderful grilled asparagus and corn just a month later. Because if you buy it when it first is available in from California, then you're bored of it and finished with it sometimes by the time the beautiful Ontario stuff comes. And of course, that's true of strawberries as well and everything. So if you get in the seasonal way, I personally do eat much more imported oranges and grapefruits than Lori does. So there's going to be a range of opinions amongst us on this, but certainly prioritizing local. And if any of your listeners can think about it, this is going into this season where we can actually grow almost such amazing things, including peaches and nectarines and all kinds of wonderful fruits and great berries. So yes, we don't grow bananas and we don't grow citrus. But other than that, we have a very robust vegetable and fruit that we can grow in Ontario.
Will the time come when we'll be farming under bubbles and indoors, or vertical farming, they call it, where, I mean, how realistic is the prospect of indoor farming so that we could afford to produce everything locally? I don't think orange trees, the space they require, I think would be a little problematic, but.
No, but I mean, there's can be a mixture of the stuff. So of course, hothouse tomatoes and herbs are very good. And we do a lot of that in Ontario, but it is very energy intensive. So there's some trade-offs. And so certainly not oranges and bananas, and certainly not all times of the year. We need a certain amount of sun for that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole, I think the important thing here is striking the right balance, and we have not got the right balance right now. Like, for example, FoodShare pioneered neighborhood markets and mobile markets, and when they went into neighborhoods where rice and mangoes were part of the diet of people, they made sure that they also had rice and mangoes available, and that makes complete sense in that context. But it's when we are constantly in a food system that is undercutting what can be grown locally and is constantly looking for quick fix technological solutions rather than working on actual preservation of the land and, preservation of land for agriculture and preventing urban sprawl, and using tools, public policy tools such as public food procurement, to shift our buying and our agriculture in the right direction. So there's a huge amount of potential for positive change that can address many social, economic, and equity issues and environmental issues without having to, we've got a long, long way to go without having to say, well, you can't have this there and you couldn't do that, or no, we can't do everything, but we can do an awful lot more than we're doing right now.
Okay, you were thinking very much in local terms, in terms of Canadian or even Toronto distribution systems and procurement systems. I tend to think somewhat, if I think about these issues at all, I think I worry more about how to make sure that people in Yemen are going to get the food that is being withheld from them deliberately in order to purposely starve them. I tend to think about what are we going to do about getting that wheat out of Ukraine and Western Siberia to North Africa in time to feed people this fall, or even maybe it's already starting.
That is part of the problem, because you see, Yemen and all countries in the world need to be trying to support their own local food systems so that they are as self-sufficient as possible and not dependent on trade. There's another wonderful person in our movement named Brewster Neen. And Brewster always said, feed the family first, trade second, feed the country first, and then trade. So if, in fact, every country took that position, and I think this is a feminist issue, I think it's very important that male leaders, who are predominantly still the leaders in the world, think about their country in the way that a woman thinks about her refrigerator historically, in terms of, or her own small agricultural plot. Feed the family first. Let's take care of all of our children so they're not starving, so that we do have strong family farms all throughout Africa. Africa has been forced, as is the Caribbean, into a trade dynamic where they had to not feed their own communities, but sell for trade, for needed dollars, right? For needed trade And this is the biggest problem in the world in terms of global hunger.
And
but you can't raise everything everywhere. I mean, I don't think Egypt is going to be a good place to raise wheat, but Siberia is, or certainly Ukraine is the best place to raise wheat. So doesn't it make sense to raise your wheat where this climate is right?
To some extent it does, but it also, not everyone needs to eat wheat. There are many parts of the world where people don't eat wheat. There are many other grains, and Africa, for example, has sorghum and millet, and many of these grains are as nutritious or more. They're part of their local cuisines. The way we think about food is not the way everyone in the world needs to think about it. We have actually reduced the foods that we are eating on this planet to a few major foods, but there's incredible diversity out there. And over the millennia, humans have eaten a much wider range of foods. So it's not that if they don't have wheat, they're going to starve. They need to go back to some of the ways that they were eating in traditional ways that used products that were grown there, plants that grew there, animals that grew there. I just got back from Africa, a month in Africa, and it was a couple of things struck me. First of all, the way their diets are shaped of the traditional peoples to use what they have in areas that are primarily desert, but is keeping them healthy, just as we talk about the Inuit who managed to stay healthy and get all the nutrients they eat, but they're not eating, or they weren't traditionally eating any wheat. So that's one thing. But the other thing that struck me is the balance in parts of Africa where it is extremely dry, is so delicate and is so well adapted. And we, by what we're doing, creating a food system that is so reliant on fossil fuels, or in continuing a food system so reliant on fossil fuels at every stage of the process, what we are doing is contributing to climate change in a way that's going to tip the balance so that they are not going to have what they need. So it's more important that we start addressing, I believe, the climate change issues connected to food right here, right now, and support people, as Debbie says, in other parts of the world to develop their own food economies.
Okay, now one of the things that I would think, I've thought a little bit about, needed to be changed is rice cultivation, because as I understand it, rice paddies produce methane because they have to have water. And the methane is a significant global warming issue. So I talked to a friend of mine in New Zealand, and we compared what we've been doing. I haven't been eating rice. Well, I never did, eat rice every day the way people in Asia do. That's their main thing they eat. And but I buy barley, and I like barley. And my friend buys millet. Now the real question is, could people who are raising rice in Asia, and it's certainly a hell of a lot of rice being produced in Asia because that's where it's consumed, could they raise millet or barley or oats or quinoa, or is there any other alternative so that they could switch over and eat something they're not used to?
First of all, the information about rice is, certain types of rice cultivation do produce methane, but there are many other forms of cultivation that produce other kinds of bads that contribute to climate change. So, and there's also many kinds of rice, and there's many ways of thinking about rice. So I think often the problem is that we have this sort of one-size-fits-all answer. In sustainable rice cultures, they are also producing protein. They have ducks, and they have fish that are growing in the rice fields. And there are many different ways that they're offsetting some of that methane that's being produced. Or they're using methods that are not as intensive in that sense. So you've got to look at the specifics. And you can't just say, oh, they shouldn't be eating rice anymore. They should be switching to millet or something like that. I mean, this is very important to their culture, but it also is not, the answer is not ecologically to say you've got to grow something different. I mean, this was exactly why the Green Revolution has been such a failure. You know, the quote unquote Green Revolution that Borlaug received the Nobel Prize for, that went into places like India and Mexico and told people, oh, you don't know how to do things, and Africa, and said, you're going to learn how to do it the way we do it. And it led to incredible intensification of fossil fuels, incredible loss of topsoil, and incredible starvation, and has been shown to have been a disaster. But it's always that we think we have the answer and we're going to, people need to figure it out. They have their own traditional ways that we don't necessarily understand. I mean, for example, they were not tilling land in Africa until the Green Revolution because they knew those topsoils were so fragile and so easily lost. So we have to be very, very careful, I think, about saying, here are big one-size-fits-all solutions. We've got to go back to local knowledge and indigenous knowledge about what grows where and how it grows and what people understand about producing food. And if we have healthy soils and we build, I mean, this is the whole thing of agroecology, which has now been accepted by the United Nations and the FAO. There's sort of a growing consensus that this is the approach we need to take. We have to think about soil, and we have to think about traditional practices, and not simply saying we've got a technological solution for it, because we don't.
You're so passionate on the subject. I run into this kind of passion when people are engaged on political levels, but it sounds you're not being political. What if you were a politician trying to solve this global problem? You know, how would you do it? What's your angle?
First of all, I would say I am extremely political, and I always think there is a very important role for policy and for politics in all of this, and have been involved in that sort of work for my whole adult life, basically. So this is a political issue for sure, but it's a political issue that requires, there's lots of different ways of approaching it. There, again, it's not one size fits all. It's that you can work on politics at many different levels around this. The work Debbie's doing is really political. I completely support it, but it's not just political.
That's interesting. I would not have thought that Debbie's work is political. In what sense is it political, Debbie?
Well, it's about changing laws and governance structures and funding apparatus and policies. But it's also that the food movement operates both at the political, the personal, and the community level. And it's kind of like the women's movement or the environment movement that way. You know, we're changing local structures and local programs and laws and politics. And I think, Meta, in terms of the crisis of politics in general, it's this new kind of politics is the only kind of politics that's going to work.
Yeah.
Really, because I am, I have to admit my orientation is very geopolitical. I think in terms of what could the UN do, or what can the EU do to get that wheat out of Odessa to where it belongs, or can they put the banks put some pressure on the shipping companies to make sure they won't insure shippers, so that they put various kinds of levers on the big decision makers. That's sort of where
that's first of all, this is such a terrible moment in all of this that it's hard to figure out how we're going to get out of it. And it's certainly not the UN, and it's certainly not politics as we know it. And negotiation isn't on the table. Who's dying, and women and children, and the destruction of so much physical land. Both Lori and I have a lot of family backgrounds. Myself, Jewish Ukraine, Lori, Ukrainian. Think about the land. When will that land actually grow healthy food that's been bombed to smithereens, right? So, but looking at a long-term strategy for health and well-being means growing enough food wherever we are to feed that population. Without that, you can't have good life. And you can't be looking at big solutions of moving wheat around the world as a way of feeding people, because that will break down always, eventually. and climate change is going to make that much, much worse. So
How much
localizing.
is, that's, you're asking me to take for granted that the amount of transportation or the energy used for transporting food is an undue part of the problem. I'm not aware of how much it adds to the carbon footprint of an orange by being shipped from California to Toronto. How much has somebody calculated things like that? How important is it? I mean, I know that you have the best wishes to do the right thing, but in pragmatic terms, is that the best thing to be doing, is worrying about how far food has been shipped to get to where we live?
It's more than that, though. It's also about community. So that's like, let's put that in there too. But in fact, there have been many studies done by the UN. Every year we have another study coming out that is showing how much the food system contributes to climate change. It's not just the transportation, it's also the refrigeration, it's also the processing, it's also the waste and the rotting food in landfills. It's also the use of nitrogen-based fertilizers, of pesticides that are synthetic, that are all part, and machinery, the large machinery that runs on fossil fuels, that are all fossil fuel derived products that are part of the food system. So this is now uncontestable. Unfortunately, the way often global warming, what contributions there are, often the maps you see, they don't show the food system. They'll show manufacturing, they'll show, people driving their cars, they'll show this, they'll show that, energy use, and food is in every single one of those categories. A portion of that comes from the food system. But until you pull that out and put it all together, you don't realize how much of our greenhouse gas emissions are actually coming from the food system. But there have been now many, many studies that have shown that exactly. And so there is no question that we actually cannot address climate change unless we address the food system.
Well, I've also
I want to take it back to the point that you're more worried about right now, Meta, which is hunger and that missing wheat. Some of that wheat is going to countries that don't need to be eating wheat and need to be growing, as you suggested, a variety of other kinds of grains that they can grow locally. We have forced the substitution. I mean, there's so many books on the destruction of local eating systems through wheat and the export of wheat, right? So I think it's very important that we think deeply about why we have such an increase in global hunger. And it's driving me crazy to look at it, looking at famine in countries that don't need to have famine. If they're, if some of the practices, as Lori described from some of the countries she visited in Africa, where they can deal with climate mitigation in such a way to ensure that at least some food can be produced. And if government leaders, and that's where it's so political, and again, where I think it's a feminist issue and a low-income access issue, if government leaders would spend more time thinking about how to feed all the people in their country, rather than buying arms or trading, then there wouldn't be so much global hunger. And we wouldn't have this particular.
Okay, but now I've heard that a large proportion of the food that is consumed today exists only because of fertilizer. And fertilizer is having some horrendous effects on the environment, especially on the oceans. It can be actually a whole existential threat, but I won't go into that. But you're not going to just hope that farmers will automatically stop using fertilizer. There has to be some sort of concerted program to develop alternatives, or to at least teach people better how to use it in a sparing way. I mean, I think that is one of the big threats, is our dependence on fertilizer.
There is a great book that has just come out. It just came out literally last week by David Montgomery and Ann Bickley, who are a geologist and a biologist. It's called What Your Food Ate. And it lays out the whole case for why we have to move off synthetic petrochemical-based fertilizers and how it can be done. And there is so much evidence and so many studies that have shown you can't do it overnight. You're absolutely right. There has to be a transition, but we are going in so much the wrong direction with those fertilizers. Most of them, as you say, they end up in the waterways because they're applied at a time when plants can't even take up the nitrogen. And so it doesn't even help us to grow the food. It ends up in waterways and causes all sorts of pollution problems there. But there is more than enough evidence. We've just been sold a bill of goods that this is the only way we can grow food, when in fact it is the only way we are going to destroy our ability to grow food.
Okay,
so I highly recommend that.
I will definitely have a look at that. Maybe I'll even call these people and say, come on my show and let's talk about fertilizer. I did talk to one guy, a couple of people about fertilizers, but they have very different takes on it. Not everybody sees it in the same way, even the experts. But let's talk about waste. Some of the things that I've also read have to do with the amount of food that is, I don't know where. I think most of it doesn't go to waste in the kitchen. It goes to waste before it gets to the kitchen. I'm not sure. But one of the things that I have fights with my house guests, when I have friends who come to visit me, they go through my fridge and they go through my cabinets and they look. They don't smell it. They don't taste it. They don't look at it. They throw it out. All they do is they look at this expiry date and they say, oh, it's overdue. You just pitch it out. And I think, well, that's ridiculous. I remember a time before there were expiry dates and nobody got sick from that. You just smelled it or you tasted it. If it looked funny, then you question whether or not to eat it. But I think there's a huge amount of waste that goes on just because they put these expiry dates on, which I don't believe in at all. How are those people going to know when my food is going to go bad in my fridge? I don't think they do.
Well, first of all, for the most part, it's not expiry dates. People have confused best before dates and expiry dates. And best before dates are just when the company determines the food would be at its optimum freshness. But there are only two products that require expiry dates by law, and that's infant formula and supplements that are given, to people with cancer and that sort of thing. And nothing else actually has expiry dates. They have best before dates. And everybody thinks that's the same thing, but it's not. But the truth of the matter is, it is true all of us need to be more careful about our food, but the majority of food waste does not happen at the consumer level. It happens in other spots along the system. So for example, there are very specific, Debbie was talking about the apples, very specific size of apple. There's a specific, believe it or not, curvature of banana that's expected.
I've heard that in the EU, certain countries couldn't join the, CAP or something in Europe because their bananas were curved, not the optimum angle or something.
And those things are left to rot. And they're never eaten. It's a sin, frankly, when there are people going hungry. And then the farmers often will not even, if they know that it's broccoli that has a few spots on the leaves because of having had too dry a season, but otherwise it's looking perfectly fine and it's edible or it's not quite the right size, they actually can't afford to even harvest it, because it costs them more to harvest it than they're going to get when they actually sell it. So it's literally left to rot in the field. Huge amounts of food are plowed under. So that's one spot. And then the other spot is in the manufacturing. A lot of food is wasted in manufacturing. And that also, so we waste food at so many places along. And the United Nations has actually said that we actually waste about, again, it's funny, about a third of all food that's produced is wasted. So it's a huge issue, and it is one we all have to take responsibility for ourselves, but we also have to say, we don't care if there's some spots on the leaves of our broccoli.
But that's still the individual level. The individual consumer is the pivot in this whole causal chain, as I hear it from you.
No, not at all.
I want to get a political party that says, I will not vote for so-and-so unless he changes the rules about how curvy bananas have to be.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe Debbie, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but that's exactly it. It is not just a personal, but it is a personal, a community, a political. There are many levels we can operate on.
Yeah. Okay. Debbie?
Yeah, I just think it's obvious too, Meta. The reason you have all those dates is big corporations trying to make you throw something out. It's not your friends. It's a concept of dead packaged food, and it's also not having food literacy. So that kind of is. I see our time's almost up. We can bring it back to everything. Children need to know how to look at a broccoli and see that it's still fresh enough to be cooked. That means they have to learn how to cook, and they need to know food systems analysis like Lori is doing at George Brown. So we need to teach ourselves about food, and then we won't waste so much food. And again, looking in our fridge and looking and seeing what we can make out of leftovers and stuff that, that many immigrant drivers taught us is the way to change it. And starting with schools and George Brown College and all of our listeners is a great way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. I'm for that. I mean, prioritize a little bit. There's so many things that could and should be done. Where do you start? And what is the most promising? I think of it as a wedge to put in a crack to, change the system. What's the most efficient, effective way of going about changing the food system that you want us to pursue? If we're giving advice to our listeners and they can only do two things today, what should they do first?
Well, localize their food system in terms of their shopping, and probably make sure that everybody has enough money to buy adequate food would be the two most important things today.
Mm-hmm.
I would support that. And I would add, from a political standpoint, work in support of public food procurement that can actually help achieve some of those goals.
Mm-hmm. And you're teaching chefs, is that right? You're teaching them not only how to cook. I presume you aren't actually in the kitchen saying, add a little more salt. But what do you teach these people? They are learning how to cook by professional chef professors. I'm not teaching those classes, but I'm teaching them the backstory of food. So what is the politics of food? How does the food system work? What are the parts that are invisible? Some of the things we've been talking about today. What kind of, where can you intersect? Where can you actually find that wedge? That's basically, and the basics of things like food literacy and how we communicate about food and how food is grown, how it actually, the soil, the role of the soil, all these policy. One of the classes that's coming up in a future is on food movements. So looking at some of the food movements around the world that have been very successful, the Nestle. What do you mean by a food movement? I'm sorry.
I mean, people getting together to say, we're going to boycott Nestle because they're trying to sell formula to women who cannot afford formula and where breast milk is going to be far superior for their children. Or the Chipka women who were saying, we're going to hug these trees because if you cut them down, we're not going to have sources of water. There's going to be huge erosion and we're not going to be able to produce food. And local movements like the ones Debbie and I have been involved in over the years, of all sorts. So we're looking at things like that. We're looking at the nonprofit sector. We're looking at equity issues and why is it some people, there's more BIPOC people are hungry than people of other backgrounds. Why is it that we need to be supporting BIPOC farmers? We need to be supporting women. There's so many different ways of thinking about the food system, and that's what people don't know. It's the invisible part of it, all behind what we see in the grocery store.
Your enthusiasm is infectious. I will go and do something extra today. I'm not sure what yet, but
right.
It's been a lot of fun, and it's great to finally get acquainted with two people that I should have known for the last 20 years because we had few friends in common, and I don't think we ever had I'm sure we haven't had this kind of conversation before. So
Right.
thanks for all you're doing and carry it on.
Thank you, and you're very welcome.
Take
Okay.
care. Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode number 470. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get there, look around. We have conversations there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.